I was walking through downtown Philadelphia at 2 a.m. with a friend who's a die-hard advocate for urban liberty. He was explaining to me, quite eloquently, why the chaotic energy and even the visible squalor of the streets were signs of a society that refuses to sanitize its problems for the sake of optics. But as he crossed a particularly dark intersection, I noticed his body language shift. His hand instinctively went to his back pocket to check his wallet, and his pace quickened. He was defending a philosophy that his own survival instincts were rejecting in real time. I didn't argue. Instead, I mentioned a scene I'd witnessed in Shanghai just a month earlier. A young woman, probably no more than 20, sitting alone on a park bench at 3 a.m., completely absorbed in her phone with her handbag sitting loosely on the slats beside her. No one bothered her. The streets were glowing under clean neon, and the sense of safety was so absolute it felt mundane. My friend's reaction was immediate. He scoffed, calling it hollow order and the peace of a cage. But that instantaneous dismissal left me with a question he couldn't quite answer. Is a city actually free if its law-abiding citizens are too afraid to use its streets after dark? We are often told that the decay in Western cities is a messy but necessary byproduct of freedom, while the clockwork safety of East Asia is a symptom of a surveillance state. But what if that's just a comforting lie we tell ourselves to excuse a failing grade? What if the true measure of a civilization isn't the rhetoric of its politicians, but the condition of its physical environment, its unvarnished report card written on its pavements at 3 in the morning? It forces us to reconsider a radical possibility, that the highest form of protection isn't found in the grace shown to the lawless, but in the absolute protection of the peaceful.
That anecdote it perfectly frames the entire paradox, doesn't it?
It really does.
I mean, if you have the theoretical right to walk anywhere you want, but the actual physical reality makes doing that a dangerous act, well, what is that liberty really worth?
Exactly. It's a right you can't use.
Right. And this tension, this constant battle between individual rights and the collective need for safety, it's an ancient problem, but it's playing out in such a dramatic, visible way in our cities today. So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack this radical idea you brought up. The possibility that public order isn't the enemy of liberty, but maybe its most essential foundation. We're going to look at two fundamentally different ways of thinking about urban governance and how they relate to the rule of law and really the social contract itself.
I really like that framing. Order is the foundation. It flips the whole debate on its head. We're essentially asking if public safety is the ultimate public good, the one that makes all the others possible.
No,
So we'll kick things off by digging into the governance philosophy that deliberately puts collective security first. This idea of social harmony, what's often called the Asian values framework. Then we'll pivot to the classic Western struggle. that constant tug of war to find the right balance between maximizing individual rights and just keeping order.
The tightrope walk.
The tightrope walk, exactly. And then finally, we'll get our hands dirty. We're going to do a kind of forensic investigation into the physical evidence. We'll ask why things like crumbling infrastructure and broken pavements are maybe the most honest sign that a social contract is failing. It's a journey from high-minded philosophy right down to the state of the sidewalk.
To really get a handle on this idea of the primacy of order, we have to start with the concept of Asian values. And this isn't some, abstract academic curiosity.
That's a real political ideology.
It's a real political ideology that became incredibly influential, especially back in the 1990s. You see it codified in documents like the Bangkok Declaration of 1993. This was a very conscious effort by leaders in the region to say, hey, we need to define a governing philosophy that's rooted in our own cultures, our own histories.
So it was an alternative to what they saw as this Western idea that liberal democracy was the only way.
Exactly. They were proposing something different, something they felt was more suited to their societies.
So it's not just a rejection of Western ideals, it's more of an assertion. An assertion of a specific, and they would argue, functional cultural basis for how to govern. What are the key elements, then, that make this philosophy so distinct?
Well, the key components are deeply, deeply influenced by Confucianism, though it's applied in a very modern context, of course.
Right.
It really stresses virtues like filial piety. Now, we usually think of that as loyalty and respect for your parents and elders, but in this framework, that loyalty extends outward. It's not just your family. It encompasses the company you work for, your community groups, and then ultimately the nation itself. It creates this whole hierarchy of responsibility and respect.
So it's like a ripple effect. If I respect my family, that sense of duty just naturally expands to respecting my employer, And then the government that provides order and stability. So like a nested system of loyalty.
That's a perfect way to put it, a nested system.
Right.
And from this deep cultural foundation, the priorities of the state just emerge naturally. There's a very strong preference for social harmony, which means actively avoiding internal conflict and, public contention.
Okay.
And there's an intense, very practical focus on socioeconomic prosperity. They see stability and economic growth as two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. The ultimate goal is the collective well-being of the entire community, and that is explicitly prioritized over the immediate wants or rights of any single individual.
Wow. That puts the individual's role in a completely different light compared to what we're used to in the West. I mean, here, the default setting is often suspicion of authority. Or we champion the rights of the individual or minority against the will of the majority.
Right. In the Asian values framework, that relationship is flipped. It's characterized by loyalty and respect towards authority figures and institutions. The preference is overwhelmingly for collectivism, for communitarianism, and this is the critical part. These values were explicitly defined in contrast to what they saw as European ideals of universal individual rights.
Which they felt were
What?
Destabilizing.
In their view, yes. Proponents felt that those ideals often risked sacrificing necessary social stability for the sake of what they would call aggressive individualism. This difference in perspective it's just foundational to everything else.
And this whole philosophy, it really found its most famous, and I think you'd have to say its most successful, practitioner in Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of modern Singapore. I mean, he didn't just theorize about this stuff. He built an entire nation on it.
Absolutely. Lee Kuan Yew, or LKY as he's often called, was the architect who took this theory and made it real. He synthesized it, and his core belief was incredibly powerful. He maintained that a nation's culture determines its fate far more than its economics or its politics alone.
He saw culture as a kind of infrastructure.
A social infrastructure, yes. The necessary foundation upon which you could then build prosperity.
He famously articulated that key difference between Asian and Western values as the primacy of group interests over individual interests. Now, that phrase is often used to criticize his model, but in Singapore, it was seen as the engine, right? The necessary engine for rapid group effort and national development.
It was seen as necessary for survival. You have to remember, Singapore was a small, fragile, multi-ethnic, post-colonial state with no natural resources. LKY argued that this rigorous social contract wasn't an end in itself. It was the only way to get to genuine, sustainable liberty.
So order first, freedom second.
His goal, and he stated this very clearly, was to have a well-ordered society so that everybody can have maximum enjoyment of his freedoms. He was completely unambiguous that this kind of freedom can only exist in an ordered state and not in a natural state of contention and anarchy. For LKY, order was the absolute precondition for any meaningful freedom. Without it, you just have chaos. You don't have liberty.
And the practical implementation of this was it was fascinating. His governance was hyper-focused, laser-focused on meritocracy, on maintaining harmony between the different multiracial groups, and on these ruthless anti-corruption efforts.
And the results? Well, they speak for themselves. They acted as this powerful global argument for his model. The economic transformation was nothing short of historic. From 1959 to 1990, Singapore's gross national product per capita didn't just creep up, it absolutely soared. It went from about $1,240 to over $18,000.
That is an incredible leap.
An incredible leap. And at the same time, social metrics improved dramatically. The literacy rate, for example, went from just 52% up to 90%. This rapid, systematic ascent provided this powerful backdrop for the continuing influence of the Singapore model.
That success clearly had global ripple effects, which I think it brings us naturally to how this idea of order as development started to inform the thinking in mainland China.
The lineage there is very direct and very intentional. Deng Xiaoping was famously and highly impressed during his big 1978 visit to Singapore.
Right.
And his interest wasn't just in the big economic numbers. He specifically noted the organized greenery, the efficiency of the city, the public housing systems. After that visit, China sent tens of thousands of officials, managers, and technicians to Singapore and other countries. The goal was to learn from their developmental experiences as a key part of the massive push toward reform and opening up. It was a clear endorsement of prioritizing order as an enabler of growth.
And if we look at the modern Chinese governance model, the rule of law seems to be defined largely through a very pragmatic economic lens. It's seen as a guarantor of a, quote, sound business environment.
Absolutely. When Xi Jinping asserted in 2019 that the rule of law is the most sound business environment, he was making a very clear statement about certainty and efficiency. The primary function of this strict approach is incredibly practical and economic. It provides certainty, it drastically reduces what economists call institutional transaction costs, and it creates predictable behavioral expectations.
So if businesses, both domestic and foreign, know that the rules are stable and they're going to be applied uniformly, they can invest and plan with a lot more confidence.
Exactly. Stability and predictability are essentially the most valuable exports of a strictly enforced legal system.
It's a product.
It's a product. And this theoretical commitment, it translates into very tangible, very systematic efforts. For example, the promulgation of the civil third. It codified market rules and provided a clear, stable legal basis for all commercial activity. Or look at the updates to the anti-monopoly law and the anti-unfair competition law. These are all designed to reinforce regulation to ensure that competition is unified, open, and, well, orderly. The emphasis is always on creating a level playing field and ensuring that contracts and property rights are secure.
That protection of property rights has to be key, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're trying to attract international business and build up market confidence.
It is absolutely fundamental. China's constitution and the civil code, they both explicitly stipulate the inviolability of lawful private property. And that framework is then reinforced by other measures, like the private sector promotion law, which mandates equal protection for all kinds of enterprises, no matter who owns them. These actions are all designed to bolster market confidence by guaranteeing that legal rights will be upheld, that contracts will be honored, and that there are effective remedies available if things go wrong. This commitment to legal certainty and predictability is what is cited as the engine behind China's ongoing progress in global business environment rankings. The big takeaway here is that for the Asian values framework, order is the necessary infrastructure to generate trust and ultimately massive economic prosperity.
Okay, so now we really need to pivot and look at the philosophical landscape in the West, particularly in the US, where the starting assumption is, well, it's almost the complete inverse. The entire system is founded on this dual principle of maximizing the rights of the individual and maintaining democratic order.
And that right there sets up a permanent built-in tension. It's a conflict that's baked into the system, unlike the collectivist model where the group interest is the clear number one priority.
Right.
The U.S. system is in this constant struggle to figure out the prevailing worth between public order and individual rights. This is where you get that famous warning, that trading liberty for security often ends with losing both. It's an ideological tightrope walk that really defines the entire structure of the criminal justice system.
So to understand the battle lines in that conflict, let's just define public order simply. What are we actually talking about when we say the absence of disorder?
In the simplest terms, public order is the absence of conspicuous disorder in a public place. It sounds so basic, doesn't it?
It sounds obvious.
But it's a non-negotiable necessity. A lack of this basic order can spiral very quickly into total chaos, which puts all citizens in danger. And the effort to just ensure basic civility standards like, clear sidewalks, unblocked traffic, quiet nights, it just sucks up immense amounts of time and resources from law enforcement.
Which brings us to this surprisingly complex category of public order crimes. These aren't the big headline-grabbing felonies we usually hear about.
Exactly. These are the acts that interfere with the efficient operation of society and just the ability of people to function peacefully. They're often considered victimless or consensual crimes. We're talking about things like disorderly conduct, excessive public noise, low-level drug offenses, public drunkenness, or driving under the influence. But the sheer volume of police resources dedicated every single day to dealing with these civility standards, it just highlights how fundamental and how fragile public order actually is.
It's the constant low-level friction.
That's a great way to put it. It's the friction that keeps society running smoothly, or not so smoothly.
That sounds exhausting. Is U.S. policing essentially becoming the world's most expensive coordinator of basic civility?
In many ways, that's not far from the truth. The minute those low-level standards start to erode, you start seeing the seeds of decay. And when the system is under pressure from rising crime or public fear, we see these two dominant models of criminal justice compete for influence.
Okay, let's start with the one that prioritizes individual protections.
That would be the due process model. Historically, this model is associated with eras like the Warren Court in the mid-20th century. It places paramount importance on the meticulous, careful protection of the accused rights. It demands equal fairness and a really rigorous procedure.
It's about getting it right, not getting it fast.
Exactly. It's designed to be slow, deliberate, and incredibly detailed. The whole point is to ensure that every possible effort is made to prevent the state from wrongly convicting an innocent person. And it accepts that this might mean a guilty person occasionally goes free because of a procedural error. The primary goal is accuracy and justice for the individual.
But when public fear rises, the demand from the public shifts dramatically. What's the countermodel to that?
That would be the crime control model. This perspective argues that the paramount function of the justice system is the suppression of crime. It prioritizes public order and public safety above that meticulous procedural fairness. When crime rates are perceived to be rising, or when the public feels that offenders are going unpunished, getting a slap on the wrist, as they say, the focus increases sharply on efficiency, on speed, and on securing convictions. The whole societal emphasis swings hard toward restoring order as quickly as possible.
So the U.S. system is in this constant state of swinging back and forth like a pendulum, a perpetual conflict driven by public sentiment and perceived danger. Whereas the Asian model we were just talking about, it anchors itself firmly in that crime control and public order necessity camp from the get-go.
That is the fundamental philosophical distinction. The West struggles with this internal debate. How much freedom are we willing to trade for safety? The Asian values framework largely answers that question right up front. It says order is the condition of freedom, so order must be secured first, permanently, and strictly.
And if we look back at Singapore, we see that commitment realized in what was often called an illiberal democracy. It restricted basic freedoms that the West considers absolutely sacrosanct.
Oh yes. Lee Kuan Yew's state was characterized by what some called strong nanny state tendencies. They very deliberately restricted press freedoms, public assembly, and other civil liberties. The regime used tools like extremely stringent defamation laws and, critically, detention without trial, a practice that would be utterly unconstitutional in the U.S., all in the service of immediate and absolute order.
And for LKY and his supporters, it was the unavoidable pragmatic cost of building a nation and, really, of survival.
Exactly. The justification is purely pragmatic. These restrictions were deemed necessary for Singapore's early existence and its almost miraculous transformation from a vulnerable developing country into one of the most stable and advanced nations in the world. From their perspective, rapid, sustained national development required a controlled, highly orderly environment where group interests and stability were never ever destabilized by individual contention or political chaos. They chose certainty over procedural fluidity.
So this brings us right back to our opening question. The Western ideal is that chaos is the price of liberty, and the Asian response is that true freedom is only enjoyed in perfect safety. We need to find the physical evidence, the data on the ground that tells us which approach builds the most sustainable society.
And the physical reality of a city provides that answer. We need to look beyond the abstract philosophy and focus on the academic theory that draws a very strong link between the state of the urban environment and the strength of the social contract.
So the rule of law isn't just about the words written down in a constitution. It's about the tangible physical condition of the streets.
Precisely. Think of the rule of law as the linchpin, the thing that holds the entire social contract together. Citizens agree to subject themselves to the law, which means giving the government a monopoly on the legitimate use of force in exchange for two core deliverables.
Okay, what are they?
Social order and essential public goods. And of those public goods, urban infrastructure is by far the most visible.
So the government has this dual, inseparable role.
It acts as both the coercive enforcer, that's the police force, and the coordinator of public goods production. That's the team that fixes the roads and keeps the water clean. And this dual nature is absolutely critical because the quality of that infrastructure acts as a highly visible, incredibly powerful signal. It's a social heuristic.
A heuristic, meaning a shortcut for judgment. The city is essentially talking to you every single day.
Yes. The quality of the urban infrastructure, the roads, the sidewalks, the air quality, the availability of clean water, even just the city's aesthetic beauty, it acts as a continuous salient signal to every single citizen. And it tells you two vital things. One, is the government committed to its end of the contract? Is it legitimate? Is it capable?
And what's the second thing?
And two, are your fellow citizens committed to abiding by the rules?
So if the government is delivering and the infrastructure looks sharp, it inspires confidence and compliance from everyone. That's the virtuous cycle.
That's the equilibrium we're all looking for. Adequate, well-maintained infrastructure signals stability and legitimacy, and this fosters what we call social cooperation. Individuals voluntarily follow the rules, like queuing up or disposing of their trash properly. It also fosters social advocacy. Citizens feel empowered to hold themselves and others accountable to the law. And this social enforcement, this citizen-to-citizen accountability, is incredibly powerful. It strengthens the rule of law, and it minimizes the need for expensive, coercive enforcement by police.
But the moment that signal fails, the minute the streetlights go out or the potholes become canyons, that's when the vicious cycle of urban decay begins.
And that decay is fundamental physical disorder. We're talking about long-lasting issues like abandoned buildings, non-functioning utility systems, or poor access to basic sanitation. When that decay becomes pervasive, the message that's screamed at the citizen is abandonment. They rationally conclude that the government and the collective body of their fellow citizens have given up on the rules of the social contract. And that leads immediately to the loss of social enforcement.
This sounds a lot like the broken windows theory, but it's applied much more broadly to all public works.
It is the systemic, measurable foundation for that concept. This is where the psychology of norms takes over, sometimes called the Cialdini effect. What we see is a clash between what are called injunctive norms, what the law says you should do, like a sign that says do not park here, and descriptive norms, what you actually observe everyone else doing.
Wait, so is there a psychology behind why, if one thing is visibly broken, everything else seems to start to break down so quickly?
Yes, absolutely. If you see mountains of litter piled up next to a broken bench, the descriptive norm, the reality that everyone litters here, overrides the injunctive norm, the law that says littering is illegal. Rule violation becomes less costly and more socially acceptable. The city's failure becomes the social proof that the rules don't matter anymore.
The physical failure of the city literally creates a cascading tolerance for lawlessness. It's contagious.
It creates a spiral of rule defection, or norm contagion, as it's called. When the perceived cost of breaking a low-level rule drops to zero, that disregard spreads very quickly to other rules. People start dashing across traffic, parking illegally, cutting lines, engaging in small-scale vandalism because they see that no one else is enforcing the rules, either socially or coercively.
And this chronic visible disorder must just hammer the average citizen's sense of self-efficacy, that feeling that they can actually influence their own environment.
It absolutely erodes what social scientists call collective efficacy. Individuals living amidst this disorder feel helpless, impotent. They lose the incentive for civic engagement. They're not going to bother with social advocacy or reporting minor crimes because they feel totally incapable of exercising any influence. This weakens the rule of law from the ground up because the social fabric just unravels. And here is the crucial financial point. Once widespread rule defection occurs, even strict coercive enforcement fails because the cost of policing every single transgression becomes completely unfeasible. You cannot afford to police a city where everyone has decided the rules are disposable.
That is a fundamental distinction. It's not that the law breaks down because there are bad people. It breaks down because the public infrastructure signal tells everyone the contract is dead. But how do we prove this link empirically? It feels true, but can we measure it?
The academic work here is quite strong. A very sophisticated cross-country data analysis was performed across 124 nations, attempting to link urban quality directly to the strength of the rule of law.
How on earth did they measure these nebulous concepts like rule of law across so many different countries?
Well, the rule of law was proxied by the Corruption Perception Index, or CPI. In simple terms, a lower CPI score, meaning less perceived corruption, is a very strong indicator of a functional, respected rule of law.
Okay, makes sense.
For the physical side, they developed something called the Urban Infrastructure Quality Index, or the Urban Index. This measured the visible daily experience of the city. Things like air quality, the quality of roads, water access, city beauty, and how safe and easy it is to walk around.
And what did the data say about the relationship between those two things?
The correlation wasn't just strong, it was striking. They found a clear, positive, and statistically significant correlation of 0.78.
0.78.
That means you're almost 4/5 of the way to a perfect one-to-one correlation. Higher infrastructure quality matches lower perceived corruption and a stronger rule of law.
But the big question always remains, right? The chicken or the egg. Does money flow to countries that already have good laws so they can afford to have nice roads? Or do the nice roads actually cause the good laws? We have to filter out the noise.
That is the crucial step. To address the possibility that this was just correlation, that rich, rule-abiding countries simply spend more on everything, they use a specialized statistical method to test for causality. They introduced a factor that would push up the urban score, but was largely independent of the country's current governance effectiveness.
And what factor do they choose for that?
World Heritage Sites.
Ah, clever.
Yeah. The presence of historically significant sites encourages investment in urban infrastructure, to attract tourism, improve the city's image, clean up the area, so that boosts the urban score. However, a country having a 1,000-year-old monument doesn't automatically mean its current government is less corrupt.
So by seeing if World Heritage Sites boost the quality of the roads, and then seeing if that boost in roads leads to a lower corruption score, they could establish a causal link.
That is the inference they were able to make. The analysis strongly suggested that higher quality urban infrastructure causes a strengthened rule of law, not the other way around. They even found this link works independently of other big factors, like the quality of healthcare or education. The condition of the basic urban infrastructure is an autonomous, foundational, explanatory variable. The conclusion is pretty unambiguous. The physical state of your public spaces fundamentally shapes whether citizens believe the social contract is worth upholding.
Okay, so if clean streets and reliable utilities are a necessary condition for a strong rule of law, why do wealthy nations like the U.S. struggle so intensely with urban decay? I mean, often in sharp contrast to European cities or, like in our opening, East Asian cities.
Well, the sources really point to a combination of foundational historical choices and, frankly, crippling policy decisions. If we start with the history, the U.S. preference for the automobile just fundamentally shapes the modern American city. Most U.S. cities, especially out west, are much newer than their European counterparts. They didn't evolve over centuries of pedestrian or horse traffic. They were largely built for the car and during the car era.
So European cities, with their dense, walkable historical centers, were almost accidentally designed for a strong social contract, whereas U.S. cities were designed to disperse it, to spread it out.
That's a great way of looking at it. And then you add to that the factor of climate and technology. Warmer climates in vast swaths of the U.S., the entire Sun Belt made walking a lot less appealing, especially once air conditioning and inexpensive personal cars became widespread. If you can drive everywhere in a cool air-conditioned box, there's just less pressure to design clever architecture for shade or to maintain pedestrian-focused urban cores.
And culturally, that high American individualism just reinforced this preference for sprawl.
Absolutely. High individualism drives the desire for single-family detached homes on big lots, suburban sprawl. The U.S. also has a much lower population density, about half that of the EU, which makes mass transit infrastructure inherently less cost-effective to build and maintain. And this created a cycle. U.S. cities historically demolished huge portions of their older, denser centers to make way for highways, surface parking lots, and car infrastructure. The entire system was built to facilitate individual movement, not collective cooperation.
And that created a self-fulfilling prophecy where businesses and city planning cater exclusively to drivers, basically punishing anyone who tries to participate in a communal, walkable environment.
The city itself became hostile to pedestrian life, which is a very setting you need for strong social advocacy and cooperation. But beyond these big design choices, specific policy decisions, particularly long-standing austerity measures, are the direct cause of decay in many struggling U.S. cities.
Urban decay, then, is an unintended consequence of fiscal policy.
It's the predictable outcome of state-level fiscal constitutions. Those are the rules governing municipal finance that enforce really strict austerity on local municipalities. They prevent local governments from receiving centralized financial support or bailouts.
What's the high-level justification for that, for forcing such strict austerity on local governments?
The justification is always fiscal discipline and preventing what's called moral hazard. Policymakers argue that by avoiding subsidies, you prevent local officials from overspending with the expectation that the state will always come and bail them out. The intent is to maximize what they call ex-ante efficiency financial caution before a crisis hits.
But the data we're looking at tells us that this financial caution comes at the cost of the social contract itself.
It completely ignores a critical trade-off. This approach prioritizes fiscal discipline, but it sacrifices ex post efficiency, the ability to avoid the societal decay and the subsequent breakdown of the rule of law. When cities are financially distressed, the very first things they cut are the most visible contract signaling services. Street lighting, road maintenance, park upkeep, blight demolition. And these cuts signal abandonment, which triggers that vicious cycle we've been talking about.
And the problem doesn't stay isolated within that one bankrupt city. The citizens move, and the problem follows them.
This is the critical infectious element, norm contagion, coupled with mobility. When individuals relocate from a severely decaying city to escape the physical disorder, they don't automatically revert to high levels of rule abundance. They often export the unlawful adaptive behavioral patterns, the conflict schemes that they developed in that decaying environment.
What does exporting conflict schemes actually look like in practice?
It means that the person who got used to ignoring traffic laws, or dumping their garbage illegally, or settling disputes through aggression because the system wasn't enforcing order, they carry those habits with them to their new community. And if that new municipality has marginal infrastructure quality to begin with, these exported habits can rapidly accelerate norm contagion in the new location. Relocation alone is not enough to restore patterns of rule abundance. The new environment has to be sufficiently orderly to override the learned habits of disorder. The social cost of decay is not contained, it spreads failure across the entire regional landscape.
So we've clearly established the failure of these two corner solutions to municipal finance. Full government insurance seems to encourage moral hazard and fiscal irresponsibility.
Right.
But hard austerity causes urban decay and the loss of the rule of law. So a viable, strong polity needs both fiscal discipline and protected urban infrastructure.
They're not mutually exclusive, they're both required.
So we need to find an interior solution, as the research calls it, something that solves both problems at the same time. What does that look like in policy terms?
The proposed interior solution is partial government insurance. Now, what this means is selective, centralized financial support for troubled municipalities. But, and this is the key part, the support must be strictly focused only on the basic contract signaling infrastructure services. We're talking about things like street lighting, water systems, and blight demolition.
So the central authority, maybe the state government, steps in to ensure the core visible public goods, the foundations of the social contract, remain functional. But they explicitly refuse to bail out local mismanagement on, say, excessive pension liabilities or unnecessary local programs.
That is the balance, exactly. This approach maintains urban infrastructure during times of distress, which avoids the ex post decay that weakens the rule of law. But simultaneously, it constrains moral hazard because the municipalities are not entirely shielded from the financial costs of their poor fiscal decisions, like those pension shortfalls. It preserves social enforcement, and it avoids the hugely increased and frankly unfeasible cost of coercive police enforcement that inevitably follows widespread decay.
This moves the entire policy discussion from a simple economic calculation to something far more fundamental. This is a question of social survival.
It provides the foundation for a really radical normative claim. The robust empirical link between urban infrastructure quality and the strength of the rule of law means we have to fundamentally reframe how we view public investment. We cannot just treat infrastructure spending as a route to economic productivity, which is the conventional argument we always hear.
We have to view it as an investment in the law itself.
Exactly. Adequate and sustained public investments in urban infrastructure are essential to support the rule of law. And this elevates infrastructure from being a simple economic concern to an allocative concern regarding the absolute foundation of civil society. Spending on functional streetlights, clean water, and smooth sidewalks has to be viewed as a bulwark against urban decay and the enormous direct societal costs that come with the breakdown of the rule of law. The ultimate protection offered by a civil society is not grace to the lawless, but the absolute protection, through visible public order and rule of law, of the peaceful. We've taken this deep dive from that philosophical clash between individual liberty and collective order, synthesized through the rapid development pragmatism of the Asian values framework, and we've landed squarely on a hard physical truth. The quality of a city's infrastructure determines whether society views its governing rules as legitimate or disposable. The abstract concept of freedom requires the concrete reality of a functioning, orderly environment to be enjoyed by everyone without fear.
What we have learned today is that the condition of the physical world is the ultimate report card for any social contract. The true measure of a civilization is indeed the condition of its pavements at 3 a.m, underscoring that public safety, predictability, and visible public order are the indispensable, non-negotiable infrastructure for true prosperity and sustainable civil liberties.